Hi, I am Jackie Kelly. I'm the Emergency Preparedness Specialist at the St. Albans Office of Local Health. I'm also a wheelchair user. My visual description, I am a white woman with long, dark hair, wearing kind of a patterned sweater, striped sweater. My pronouns are she, her, and I'm really happy that we're doing this presentation. Eric?
Perfect. So my name's Eric Pulver. I'm the Emergency Preparedness Specialist for the Rutland District Office, and I am a co-coordinator for the Rutland Addison MRC. My pronouns are he, him, and my visual description is that I have no hair on my head, I have a little bit of a beard, and I have a white wall behind me, and I have a black polo shirt on.
And I'm just going to redo my intro for the recording, if that's cool. I'm Emerson. I use he, him, or they, them pronouns. I'm the disability inclusion person in the Office of Health Equity in Central Office. I'm a white person with light brown hair, headphones, glasses, and a plant and some books behind me. I'm going to go on to the next slide for us, Jackie. So just to take you through our contents of our presentation today. I'm going to walk you through some models of disability and disability etiquette standards. Then we're going to move on to introduction to access and functional needs and CMIST frameworks, including what those are. We're going to move on to talking about the Vermont Cares Registry, and then COVID-19 impacts on access and functional needs communities and pod strategies, the 2023 flood response, and then we'll have some time for questions at the end. All right. I'm just going to describe this slide real quick. This is a slide about models of disability. And we're going to talk about two main ones. There's a bunch of them. You could make up new models too if you want. That's what's so fun about using different lenses. But there's two main ones that we want to talk about today. And the first one is the medical model, which is probably what you think about when you think about disability. And I'll read from this up here. Biomedicine defines being disabled through medical definitions, diagnoses, but this stigmatizes disability to be a problem or a disadvantage with the person that needs to be fixed or cured. So it's a medically defined state of health. And this is as opposed to the social model of disability, which I really love the picture up in the top right to describe that. And it basically looks at disability through the lens of the environment and whether or not the environment that the disabled person is in is one in which they are enabled or disabled. And so the graphic on the top right says, when I can't access your website, you disable me. When I can't access your building, you disable me. When your recruitment process isn't accessible, you disable me. When your company culture isn't accessible, you disable me. So that and this other little comic in the bottom right, which shows a person in a wheelchair at the bottom of some stairs, and it says, "Weigh in, everyone welcome." It's a little bit small to read, but the medical model is on the left, and it says that her impairment is the problem. They should cure her or give her prosthetics, help her up the stairs. And then the social model of disability is that the stairs are the problem. They should just build a ramp. So that's the main difference between these two main models of disability. And then we know about lots of different isms, just like racism or sexism. There's this thing called ableism, which has to do with discriminating against someone on the basis of a disability. And I'll just read this definition. It is by far my favorite definition of explaining how all of this ties in together and influences our health. But ableism is a system that places value on people's bodies and minds based on societally constructed ideas of normality, intelligence, excellence, desirability, and productivity. These constructed ideas are deeply rooted in anti-Blackness, eugenics, misogyny, colonialism, imperialism, and capitalism. This form of systemic oppression leads to people and society determining who is valuable and worthy based on a person's language, appearance, religion, and/or their ability to satisfactorily reproduce, excel, and behave. You do not have to be disabled to experience ableism. Are they getting the slides at the end, Jackie? Okay, because that's a lot to digest, and I would want to also look at it after the presentation if I were the audience. Thank you. So
I will send it out after.
Awesome. Thank you so much. In some of my work, I've been doing accessibility related leadership at central office, and this is a gold standard accessibility practice that really ties into disability etiquette. I'm used to saying equity, and in general is just gold standard for interacting with a disabled person, and that is be multimodal, have multiple modes of communicating, of teaching, multiple modes. And if there's one word that you remember, it should be multimodal, because accessibility is something that it doesn't really have an end. It's a big thing, and it looks different for every disabled person. So being able to adapt what you're doing to whatever that person's needs are is the best way to go. And this picture is from Universal Design for Education. So it says learning, but it could also be for communication. And it says provide multiple means of engagement, representation, and action and expression. Go ahead, Jackie.
So this is where I take over a little bit. So first, hopefully it works. Sometimes videos and Zooms are a little bit difficult, but this is a video on compassion crisis care from the Virginia Medical Reserve Corps that they put out just a few months ago.
All right, I'm gonna do my best. You're gonna have to tell me if you can hear it.
Okay.
No. Okay, there's a way to get audio, right? Or is it not because it's expensive? Okay.
It's sharing options.
1 second.
You can share it. I know in Teams you have to choose it when you're starting to share. So,
And Marcin, are you familiar with how to share audio on Zoom?
I was about to say the same thing. I think it's when you choose to share screen, you can share screen and audio at the same time.
stop sharing.
Share this here. Okay, 1 second. Oh, now I can see my screen.
Yeah. Your mouse is over there.
Sorry. My mouse is there. Okay.
So if you share screen, share sound, and then choose that. I can put your mouse back up there. There it is.
Okay, take 2.
Global health emergency.
At least 6 states banning large gatherings of people.
This is what
Oh, I'm sorry.
healthcare workers have resorted to. They're wearing garbage
They
bags.
decided to evacuate 78 of its residents and move them someplace new.
The COVID-19 pandemic showed how devastating a medical emergency or natural disaster can be to nursing homes, from a lack of safety equipment to isolation to a staggering loss of life. Severe staffing shortages also meant outside crisis response teams had to fill in, often with no experience.
I'm so sorry, everybody. I promise I'm better than this. I'm just trying to share this video. Okay, 1 second. Hold on. No, wait. I'm gonna. Okay, my mouse goes over here. I'm gonna unshare this. Sorry, everybody. I really, truly apologize. Shouldn't be allowed to do this. All right, there we go. Share sound. Share. Now we can watch the video.
And you can make it.
Are you seeing my screen?
Yes, I can see all of YouTube. So if you click on that or the full screen, yes.
All right, I'm just gonna play it again. There we go. Okay.
Organization just declared this a global health emergency.
At least 6 states banning large gatherings of people.
This is what the healthcare workers have resorted to. They're wearing garbage bags.
Decided to evacuate 78 of its residents and move them someplace new.
The COVID-19 pandemic showed how devastating a medical emergency or natural disaster can be to nursing homes, from a lack of safety equipment to isolation to a staggering loss of life. Severe staffing shortages also meant outside crisis response teams had to fill in, often with no experience, working with residents with neurological impairments that could lead to disruptive behaviors. We know that challenging behaviors are difficult, not only for the resident, but also for staff and crisis responders. This video training series is designed to prepare crisis responders to provide compassionate crisis care, to reduce challenging behaviors during emergencies and disasters when every minute counts. In this video, our focus is on a critical first responder in nursing homes, the Virginia Medical Reserve Corps.
MRC volunteers played an important role in nursing homes during the pandemic. We collected COVID tests, administered vaccines, and even filled in for staff at some facilities. Volunteers also help nursing home residents when they're evacuated to emergency shelters during emergencies or disasters. At least 95% of nursing home residents have behaviors that may be challenging due to neurological or psychiatric disorders, including dementias, mental illnesses, and mild cognitive impairment. In addition, are residents suffering behavioral complications from strokes, traumatic brain injuries, and intellectual disabilities. All of these impairments can lead to behaviors that can be difficult to manage, even for MRC volunteers with medical experience. In this video, we'll learn more about these challenging behaviors, as well as some positive interaction techniques that can help avoid or diffuse them. These techniques are rooted in patient-centered care, which is an approach that starts with understanding the resident's point of view and then individualizing care to respond to their unique emotional and social needs. Let's look at how challenging behaviors might emerge during routine nasal swab testing.
Time to take your test.
No. Who are you? Who are you? What do you want?
Won't hurt.
No. Hey, this is not right. Get away. No.
Neurological impairments can change the way residents perceive their environment, distort their visual and auditory processing, reduce their ability to make sense of what's happening, or to make their needs known. Just imagine how disconcerting it would be for a resident with dementia to see a stranger wearing full PPE invade their personal space with a nasal swab.
From a person-centered care perspective, challenging behaviors are more than problems to be dealt with and suppressed, but rather important clues that can help the caregiver perceive what may be going on in the mind of the resident. It is the resident's way of communicating stress, confusion, or feeling threatened. And we need to try and understand what the resident is trying to communicate and communicate back with calm, non-threatening care that helps diffuse agitation and confusion that the resident is experiencing.
Disruptions to routines, new faces, and irregular procedures are especially difficult for residents with neurological impairments. Understand that you may need to spend more time with these residents to avoid disruptive behaviors. Use the following positive interaction techniques to build trust, minimize confusion for the resident, and help you accomplish your work more effectively. Reduce stimulations like noise or bright lights. Use non-threatening body language and facial expressions. Communicate face-to-face and at the resident's eye level. Use a calm tone of voice. Communicate simply and clearly, and not too quickly. A resident may need time to absorb what you're saying and make sense of it. Give the resident time to respond. If available, ask a regular staff person or a trusted family member to be present. Their presence and knowledge of the resident can help avert many disruptions. If that's not possible, your MRC partner can provide a comforting presence to the resident while you administer the test. Let's see how these positive interaction techniques can improve our emergency situation.
Hello, Mrs. Martin.
Yeah.
My name is Hillary. I'm a nurse. And this is Nancy. She's also a nurse.
You're a nurse too?
Yes.
You look kind of funny.
Yes. And we're here because we need to do a test on you, okay?
Test?
Yes. It's just a swab of the back of your nose. It won't hurt. It'll be a little uncomfortable, but it won't hurt. Is it okay if we do that?
My nurse said it's okay.
Yes, we're doing all the residents here today.
Okay, yeah.
Okay, is that all right? So is it okay to go ahead and do this?
Okay.
Okay? All right, here we go.
MRC volunteers might also interact with residents in emergency shelters if they are evacuated during an emergency or natural disaster.
How are you?
Where am I?
This is a shelter.
Where?
This is a shelter in Norfolk.
Am I safe?
You're absolutely safe here.
Why am I not home?
Can I get your name?
No. No, am I safe?
You're safe here. You don't need to be
I'm afraid.
You don't need to be afraid.
Am I safe?
Am
I safe here?
You're absolutely
Hi,
safe.
I'm Gwen.
Gwen?
You're going to be just fine here. You're safe here, as a matter of fact. So, hey, you know what? How about we watch a movie together? It's a great movie on my phone. My cell phone. We can, as a matter of fact, we can go right over here at this quiet place and watch the movie together.
Now?
Yes, right now. Okay? So let's turn around here. Okay, and I heard that your name is Lee.
Yes.
So let's go over here.
Changes in routine can trigger agitation. If you notice agitation, gently approach the resident with non-threatening body language and reassure them with a calm tone of voice. Gently redirect the resident's attention to a different activity. Encourage your MRC team to have diversion items that engage residents' hands, such as fidgets, magazines, simple crafts, or items to fold. If nothing else is available, you can use your cell phone to play music or show a movie that may engage the resident. Let's see how these techniques can help in this situation.
I think you're going to enjoy it. And
movie?
Let me pull up my chair here. I'm gonna sit down beside you and watch it and take out my phone.
Movie?
Okay, here we go. So, you're gonna love this.
It's also important to remember that not all behaviors are challenging or problematic. For example, a resident pacing or exploring may be a frustration to staff, but not a challenging behavior if the resident is not at risk or putting others at risk.
If you are unsure, you can ask a supervisor or nurse at the shelter for guidance. And if you have enough MRC volunteers available, you could assign someone to accompany residents who want to walk or to sit with residents who exhibit confusion.
Also, be aware of the signs and symptoms of someone who is escalating towards aggression or about to have a break. These signs can include pacing, removing clothing, particular types of staring, changes in cognition, changes in ability to articulate verbally, mood changes, as well as other signs listed on the screen.
Let's look at another emergency situation where a young resident with a traumatic brain injury is struggling at an emergency shelter.
I want to be here. I want to go home. I want to go home.
Okay.
I want to go home.
I can help. I can help.
Get the hell away from me.
I can help.
I said get the hell.
In this situation, the resident has become physically aggressive and may pose a safety risk to the volunteer and themselves. Block any blows. Never hit back at a resident. Step out of reach and remain calm. Don't take verbal abuse personally. Use calming communication techniques. Redirect attention. If you are not able to diffuse aggressive behavior, notify a supervisor immediately. And most importantly, make sure to inform any first responder who becomes involved that this resident may have a neurological disorder, which may affect their ability to comprehend the situation they are in or to communicate clearly.
By working together to provide compassionate crisis care, we can be prepared for emergencies in the future and give residents the care and dignity they deserve. For more information, please log on to the website on your screen.
So as we saw in the video, that was a lot of good information that can be used in specific instances, either when you're visiting a skilled nursing facility to aid
Also
staff
meant
there,
outside crisis
or if there's a shelter set up and there are people there that have access and functional needs. That was some good information to be able to use that in those kind of situations. Awesome. So that was some direct level work with individuals. And this is going to be a little bit more of that high level stuff. So one thing that the Centers for Disease Control, the CDC, uses is something called Crisis and Emergency Risk Communication, or CIRC. And CIRC is very widely available. It's used by obviously the CDC and many states to be able to communicate information during a disaster. And the 6 principles of CIRC that are very important are that to be first. Sometimes you aren't going to be first if you are working in a shelter or if you are aiding in some sort of emergency. But we always want to be right. So you want to have accurate information that you are able to give at the time anyone asks. And that makes you more credible. You want to be honest. You want to give good, truthful information, because the more credible you can be, the more trust you can build and rapport you can build with people experiencing probably some of their worst days that they will experience. And continuing on, you want to express that empathy. You all are MRC volunteers because you have boundless amounts of empathy. So use that to your advantage. And you want to promote action. So you want to be able to direct people to the services or the needs that they are expressing. And how you do that could be, many different ways, and thinking about how people may have access and functional needs will change what kind of actions you would promote. So it's one of those things that you do need to kind of think about as, each person you're helping, is there. And then obviously, especially for everyone, but, when we really get into people with access and functional needs, you want to show respect. So respectful communication, making sure that you are understanding they're a person first. They are not, just another number, another survivor, another victim, that they are a person first, and that they, everyone deserves our respect. And I bring this up because as a MRC volunteer, you do represent not only the Medical Reserve Corps, you also represent the Department of Health. And so you can be relied on to be sort of an extension of those two things. So being able to use these principles of CIRC, when you are dealing with anybody that is, experiencing a disaster is incredibly important. And so as to that sort of be right, be first, be credible, you also want to keep up to date on communications that you will get from the state. And so the number one way you can do that is by signing up, making sure everything's updated in your VT alert. That'll be the public-facing alerts that the state will send out. And so you'll be able to get information specifically about the county you're in, or even the towns you are in. And those are incredibly useful to be, up to date in what the state is putting out. And then obviously you can use the Vermont Department of Health's website. It will be updated regularly, especially during disasters. We even created a specific flood website specifically in July. And so that would be another useful source for any sort of information that you might need. So we just did some high level, looking at CERC and sort of how that can be effective and useful, for everyone that is, dealing with your survivors or anybody, during a disaster. And so now we're going to come back a little bit more to some communication strategies that you can use with anyone, but they're also very useful with people with access and functional needs. And number one is this: if possible, just ask that individual or the individuals that you're talking with how best to communicate with them. The person is going to know their, abilities to communicate, their preferred methods of communication way more than you can probably, just kind of visually or auditorily figure out. So just ask, it's the best way to do it. You want to remember to have a lot of patience and a lot of empathy. Sometimes, you're going to run into people that maybe English is their second language. And so it might be a little bit of difficulty to actually talk with them. And so if you just have some patience and some empathy, that will make that entire conversation, I won't say pleasant, but it will be a lot easier to get through. And then another thing, if you need to write anything, you're going to want to use plain language. So plain language, the definition of that is basically a communication is in plain language if its wording, structure, and design are so clear that the intended audience can easily find what they need, understand what they find, and use that information. And so if you're able to write something in very plain language, very, clear and concise language, then that will also help anyone that, may need to get that communication from you. And then, another way to do it is just find other means to communicate. If somebody's having issues with auditory communications, maybe they're hard of hearing, maybe use writing. Maybe they are another person who has, that English is a second language, maybe try and find a translator or use some sort of translation service that the state has. Or just visuals, pictures. If you have someone who is nonverbal, maybe being able to use picture items of what you're trying to get them to get, some water or food or medicine, might be another way. And then there are some apps that you can find for your phone. They're on both Apple phones and Android phones. I will say with one word of caution that with any translation apps, your Google Translate or your Microsoft Translate, you want to use those if there is no official state translation resources available. And that may happen if, we have a large scale disaster, it might take a long time to be able to get through translation services if you can't get to them at all. So I would say that it is an option, but it should be one of those options as the last resort.
Things around real quick. There we go. So just real quick, I just want to add something before we go into this slide on communication. If someone does come into maybe a shelter or something else, and they're with maybe a personal care person or personal assistant, translator, anybody like that, it is important to speak to the individual rather than the person that they're with, just for your knowledge. Okay. So today we're talking about access and functional needs. I'm not sure how many of you have heard those terms before, but access and functional needs describes people who might need additional assistance before, during, or after an emergency due to any type of condition, whether it's temporary or permanent, that might limit their ability to act. And this term and concept really takes a social model of disability approach, because it's not saying that someone can't act because they're let's say they're a wheelchair user and they're unable to quickly evacuate their house, or because because it's their fault. That's not what it's saying. It's saying that they're unable to act because of maybe the environment or resources that they don't have. It's really looking at what are the access and functional needs, or another term, resources, that a person needs to be able to successfully and quickly evacuate or gain access to if they're, let's say they're staying at home instead of evacuating, that they're getting access to the services that they need. And this ranges, like lots of people fit into this category, not just disabled people and older adults, but also pregnant people, children and infants, people who don't speak English as a first language, people experiencing homelessness, people who may not have the financial means to evacuate or to be self-sufficient after an event or recover from an event, people with limited access to transportation or don't have access to transportation, people of different types of ethnicities. That's not due to the ethnicity, that's more so in the sense of as an underrepresented group that experiences marginalization in our society. They might not have equitable access to resources, so they might fall under access and functional needs. Kind of going through something similar here, it's just a framework that suggests that there are resources everybody needs during and after emergencies, regardless of who we are. And that means that everyone needs access to resources to function during emergencies. And some people might have those resources or might know how to get it, might have the financial means to access those resources, and other people might not. And it's not only a financial resource, it's also it can be cultural, like we were looking at the social model. It can be environmental, right? Like you can't, you're trying to access transportation to evacuate and there's no accessible transportation. It can be, like I said, cultural or societal, where society, lights keep going on and off here. Where like people and society marginalize you, and so you might not have access to those resources due to that. It's also important to understand that public health and emergency management look at access and functional needs from a different perspective. So public health looks at it from a health equity perspective versus emergency management looks at it more from a resource perspective. So what I mean by that is so emergency management is I want to know what resources do you need to be able to do this. Public health looks at it more like, okay, if we provide this resource to this individual or to this population, that will improve their health equity. So I have in here, by ensuring equitable access to transportation and communication before, during, and after emergencies, health equity for access and functional needs communities is improved. Then we're going to talk about some CMIST resources. So CMIST is a memory tool for the purposes of emergency planning, preparedness, response, and recovery. It's utilized to help people remember and include the 5 functional resource needs individuals may have in an emergency or disaster. Those 5 functional resources are communication, maintaining health/medical, independence, support services/safety, and transportation. So why is CMIST important? It helps to identify the actual resource needs during an emergency rather than labeling people as special needs or vulnerable populations. One thing I do want to mention about vulnerable populations, a right way and a wrong way of using the term vulnerable populations. Traditionally, it's used in the sense that a community or a group is vulnerable to an emergency is of something that they are limited in, right? It's their fault that they're vulnerable. They're unable to do something. There's also another way of looking at vulnerable populations and using that term in a sense of socially vulnerable populations. And that takes a social model approach where it's saying people are socially vulnerable to emergencies because of the things around them and because of inequitable access to resources. So it's a social problem, not a problem with the individual themselves. The other thing that I will also just mention really quickly is that we see this labeling special needs or vulnerable populations, particularly when we talk about registries, which we will go into later. But those are common terms used in registries. Access and functional needs and CMIS resources have not yet really been picked up in registries, but they are becoming more common terms and frameworks and ideas used both in emergency management and public health. So hopefully states that have registries will start to kind of switch over. So whole community inclusion basically just means integrating and coordinating the access and functional needs of the whole community in preparedness, response, recovery, and mitigation. So when we're talking about emergency planning, or let's say we want to do an exercise as a MRC unit or as a Department of Health or a local office that's more large scale, you really want to be bringing in people with lived experience rather than just assigning people roles. So for instance, let's say we wanted to have a large scale drill or exercise, and we need an actor to be a wheelchair user. And rather than having a non-disabled person pretend to be a wheelchair user, we should be bringing in someone who is actually a wheelchair user to give that real world experience. Same thing with other things. We shouldn't have English speakers pretending to be Spanish only speakers, right? So, and also when we do emergency planning, we should be doing it with the entire community. So it shouldn't be one agency or group sitting down and planning for the needs of another without them at the table. And that also causes a lot of annexes, which we don't like. The needs of people with access and functional needs really need to be spelled out and addressed throughout the entire plan, not just an annex. So that happens when we don't include people in the planning. This here just kind of goes through a little bit more in depth on what those things mean. Communication. So again, for instance, individuals with communication needs may use American Sign Language, have limited English proficiency, use Braille print or other auxiliary aids and devices to communicate or navigate their environment. These individuals may have limited ability to hear announcements, see signs, understand messages, or verbalize their concerns. This really goes back to what Emerson was talking about with making sure things are multimodal. So you can see here that it's important to provide translators and interpreters, to provide print in Braille, to have just different ways of communicating, not to have announcements written and not only auditory, to have signs in, really large print, plain language. So people may not be able to understand messages. It's important to use plain language. Have different ways to communicate with people who cannot communicate verbally. So you can just see there what that means. Maintaining health and medical, that might be partnering with community partners and organizations to be able to help people access medications and supplies and services, durable medical equipment, electricity, things like that. Independence might be helping people access support services. That's another one, but it can also go under independence. If someone were to need home health or any type of personal assistance, mobility devices or assistive technology, anything like that. Support services, again, that's more of the personal assistance. They need anything for their safety, for instance, life alert buttons, thing like that. That could be something under safety, helping people to find different ways to help people remember things. Maybe they write things down. Transportation, access to accessible transportation and reliable transportation.
These are just a couple of case studies for us to sort of walk through together. I don't know, Jackie, if we have time to just have people brainstorm which letters of the CMIST acronym would go for each of these two. So I'll read the first one and then you can toss whichever letters you think might apply in the chat, just to kind of apply these to a couple of different situations. So The first one is Robert had a stroke and uses a wheelchair to get around. He doesn't have access to reliable transportation and needs to evacuate his home. Maybe you can go back to the previous slide so they can see the, yeah.
Well, certainly transportation is a problem. And I would kind of hope in times of a disaster that you have agreements with agencies like Green Mountain Transportation, which is the one that we use up here in Franklin County. There's an SSTA down in Chittenden County that we can communicate with them about the people who cannot physically get out of their homes and don't have transportation.
I see the whole CMIST acronym in the chat. I also see CISNT. Do either of you want to explain yours? If not, we can move on to the next one. I would agree that all of them probably apply in some way to his situation, particularly the communication aspect, because if he has had a stroke, I don't know if maybe he has some aphasia, and whether or not he might be able to communicate well. But really every single letter. And then for the second one, we have Helen is deaf and uses ASL to communicate. She and her young son, who takes medication for epilepsy, have been moved to a temporary shelter. I would also agree here that almost all of them apply. I think potentially all of them. These examples are very similar to the examples in the HHS hour-long training that they have. And it's free. You can go and find it and do it if you'd like to learn more. But the whole point of me sharing these examples is to share that like it's usually most of them or many of them, and there's a lot of overlap. But CMS can be really helpful for sort of using a structure and a framework to look at their needs through different lenses and figure out how you can help. I should have written down what CARES stands for. I did not. But CARES is an acronym. And it's an acronym that refers to a registry that we have in Vermont. At least 30 other states have registries. They're pretty common. Some information. They don't necessarily give all of the information that you need or even close to all of the information that you need. And I think when we think about like the definition of access and functional needs that Jackie shared earlier, just how broadly that applies, we can really understand how much we're underestimating with a registry, and how that can be kind of dangerous. But at least for public health, like planning purposes. So just a few caveats about registries is that they're based on a lot of assumptions. A lot of them, oh, thank you so much. Citizen Assistant Registry for Emergency Services. I super appreciate that. They're based on a lot of assumptions that lead to underestimation, inaccurate data, and a false sense of security for both emergency personnel and community members. So they're a piece of paper, a form that you fill out, and it tells you something about the folks who are filling the form out. And the people filling the form out think that this guarantees them some assistance in an emergency. And the people, us, giving the form to others to have filled out, they know that, essentially. There's the assumption that everybody with access and functional needs, all disabled people, will register, will know about the registry, will identify as disabled or special needs, and will understand enough to register. There's the assumption that people with access and functional needs will always be home, and or are homebound. So a lot of these registries ask where do you live, with the assumption that that would be like where you go to help them. And a lot of people with disabilities end up, not being home in the event of an emergency. So it's less helpful. And then there's the assumption that people registering will understand that there is no guarantee of help. And our registry form does say that on it, but some of them don't. So just to recap, the registries are created with outdated technologies steeped in the harmful biases of the medical model. There's really no easy replacement for doing the hard and long work of planning with community partners and leaders and organizations that know these communities well and can advocate for their needs and or are part of those communities. So this is just an image of our probably old at this point, Heather, care registry form. It was the only one I had access to. So some of the language is going to change, but this is just to show you the kinds of questions that are answered. So the kinds of information that might be in the system somewhere about people that you interact with. And some of these questions do apply pretty specifically to the CMIS framework. Like I do not have transportation available to leave the area. I have specialized medical equipment that is powered by electricity. If you click one more time, this is just a helpful graph showing just a way to think about the data that we are getting with a registry versus with an access and functional needs lens. So this is a series of circles. The biggest circle, it says a whole population. There's a slightly smaller circle inside that says people with access and functional needs. A slightly smaller circle that says ACS disability data, and then a very small circle that says special needs registrants. Remember that ACS was 4 times, like this is based on actual percentages, and the ACS is 4 times the amount of the registry one. So in collaborating with community organizations, there are a few different things that we try to think about. And we think about some similar things from the public health perspective with health equity in mind. So these are just some basic principles. With collaboration, you are sharing your power. So as government workers, as medical providers, we all have a lot of power. These people that we're interacting with don't have a lot of power. And so we need to give some to them and share it. And that really, it lets us also recognize that I don't know your needs. You need to be able to share your needs. So something else that we think about in the health equity world is moving at the speed of trust. That is the only way a relationship can work. And even with a brief encounter, you are establishing a relationship. And so recognizing if there isn't trust, or if there is trust, or how much of it there is really important. And then just recognizing that I don't know your experience, you don't know my experience, knowing that I'm probably going to make some assumptions, and being open and humble about where I am and the limitations of my ability to help can also be helpful. So humility is really important. And then using community leaders and leveraging existing connections. I heard it earlier. I don't remember who was speaking, but I heard it earlier. And inviting, so this is a sharing power thing, inviting them to our table versus showing up to their tables sometimes can be pretty impactful in terms of establishing a shared power.
Hi, this is Laurel. I'm on the NEK MRC, and what you just said about people in communities, and a lot of people, especially in these really small towns, they know everyone and they know where people live. And I was an HC volunteer and evaluator, whatever that big Cat 5, Cat 4, whatever that big statewide disaster preparedness drill we did before COVID, in a little town in Vermont. And I was in the town hall with this guy who's emergency preparedness guy, but I think he wore a bunch of hats, select board, whatever. And, he had a whole town, a whole map of the whole town. And, he knew where everybody lived and who lived there. and probably, generations who live there. So I think that's really important to really use those sort of local resources. I mean, it's not going to be the case in some of the bigger towns in Vermont, but maybe neighborhood by neighborhood.
Thank you. You articulated that really well. Click on Jackie.
A lot of information about access and functional needs and why they're important. And so I think we're going to talk a little bit about sort of some of those real world impacts, especially during COVID. And, COVID really, pretty much laid bare just the issues, across the, spectrum of everything. But there's a lot of access and functional need communities that had some large impacts, and these are not going to be, all of them by any means, but, a number of them, did come up. So, a lot of issues came up with sort of like a lot of personal assistance services were just like unavailable, which kind of works itself also with that sort of limited American Sign Language interpretation, which is that, when you are unable to be around a lot of people, it makes it much more difficult to have any sort of interpreters in the room with you. And so you might have people who, were in a room by themselves, isolated because they had COVID, and just were unsure of what was going on because of the communication barriers, because they did not have the access to those assistant services, their translation services or interpretation services that normally would be there, that COVID sort of took away from a lot of these populations. And just ventilators needed to be moved around constantly. I mean, people that were in sort of late stage COVID disease were usually placed on ventilators, and those were having to be moved pretty much hospital to hospital, area to area pretty much continuously. And so that sort of the people who weren't not having COVID but also needed access to ventilators were sort of basically at the whim of where the ventilators were needed at that time during COVID. And just the rationing of all of the sort of useful pharmaceuticals that we use to kind of try and combat COVID, especially in the early days. Those people that were going to need those pharmaceuticals or those drugs or their, prescriptions that, for other ailments that weren't COVID, we're going to be running into rationing because those drugs were needed to help with the pandemic. And then, along with that same issue of being isolated or quarantined or sort of social distancing, is that there's a lot of transportation that was reduced. So you couldn't necessarily get into a enclosed car with another person because of social distancing or whatever. So that sort of limited a lot of the access to get people or moved around to clinics or hospitals or their doctor's appointments or just any sort of other appointment that they may need to get to.
Just in addition, there was also not really a whole lot of accessible transportation to points of distribution, so people could even just receive their vaccinations.
Yeah, I mean, there was a lot of vaccination clinics and pods and all those kind of things that happened were usually pretty much done with cars. They were drive-throughs, and so people did not had limited access to those. They had limited access to getting to the vaccination clinics or pods or whatever you want to call them. So this is a quote from a VT Digger opinion article, where it basically kind of talks about sort of what COVID kind of did at the sort of coming out of COVID. It's a situation where we are kind of stuck in this, having to deal with the fact that we're going to not only deal with COVID, but we're going to deal with all the after effects of COVID for a very long time. And we're going to have to sort of get to this, I don't like to call it normalcy, but sort of, that's what we have to kind of think about, is that, the reality is that we're kind of going to be stuck with a lot of this just high levels of illness. And it's something that, we, don't want to have. And so we have to kind of figure out a way to kind of reduce the burden that sort of COVID is going to leave us with. And how do we do that is one way is to talk about sort of everyone and how sort of people with access and functional needs they need to be looked at, and they need to be brought to the table, and they need to be collaborated with instead of just written into an annex at some point by a preparedness planner. And so this is going to be a few sort of guiding questions on how we can kind of make more inclusive pod strategies. So thinking about creating these point of distribution sites that are going to be is it accessible? Is there a ramp to the door? Is there elevators in the area? Those kind of things. Do the doors have the buttons to allow them to open? Those kind of things. Are we using signage that are sort of going to follow sort of the American with Disabilities Act, accessibility requirements? Are we going to, maybe start doing some sort of pod planning with a lot of members of these sort of access and functional needs communities? So that way, we're not just trying to think through it, they're actually going to be able to say, this will be an issue. I don't necessarily, have any idea, all of the ideas of, if somebody that is having some sort of mobility issue, I won't be able to know exactly what all of those that might come up, just because, I'm not, I don't have the mobility issue. And so, continuing on, just, are the instructions written in sort of that plain language in that inclusive manner? And are they in multiple formats? Is it, only written, or is there sort of, a way for auditory or any other sort of modalities that they could be written in? And so I won't go through all of these because, there's just lots of ways that we can make sort of some of our pod strategies more inclusive.
Eric. So moving on to the flood response, some of you may know these already or have witnessed them or have experienced them. But these were some things that came to light with the flood response. So the first one and major one that became very obvious very quickly was the lack of translated notifications. Emerging notifications leading up to the floods and following were in English only. And the Vermont Language Justice Project created translated videos in multiple languages, but they didn't translate them in American Sign Language. It's also important to know that their videos were wonderful, but they were videos on, how you can be safe and prepare or respond to the flood. These weren't videos on this emergency notification just came from VT Alert and here's a translated version of it. That's not what the videos were. So they were super helpful, but there was still some lacking information. There was definitely partnership through the health equity team with community partners. It was pretty delayed. So a lot of important information just wasn't coming through in other languages and formats. I think too was that there were limited emergency information specific to people with access and functional needs. So there wasn't a whole lot of resources or just information in general that was sent out prior to inform people who might need access to different resources or might struggle in different ways on how to prepare or what to do. There was no information like that. So that left a lot of people in a really difficult spot. And then also there were quite a few barriers in our multi-agency resource centers and disaster resource centers. There was a lack of signage directing people to the centers. There were inequities with the water test kits regarding language access, and also the form that people needed to fill out wasn't very intuitive. It was a little bit difficult to follow. So people that were distributing test kits really needed to go through the form and tell people this is where you fill it out and this is what each section is. So it wasn't easily accessible for a lot of people. And then there were limited translated material on our tables. The VDH Health Equity Director was deployed late to the State Emergency the State Emergency Operations Center, and that made it difficult to address equity concerns early on. There was also limited focus on those with unstable or no housing prior to the floods, and that is mainly because FEMA was providing financial assistance to those who lost property due to the flooding. Because there was such a focus on people who lost property, there wasn't as much of a focus on those who may not have they didn't already have access to that. And so they lost even more, whatever they had. So those are some things that came out of that. And here is a quote from another Vermont Digger article specific around the limited English translated alerts and emergency communications in other languages. Director of the Vermont Field Office of the U.S. Committee for Refugees and Immigrants said not a single alert was sent in any other language. And I think that's just really powerful to understand how left behind those people were. So we have some time for questions. Just real quick before we go into that, I do just want to let you know, we have our contact information here. Like I said, this will get sent out to you all. We have a resources page if any of you want to learn some more. We have some apps that you might be interested in for large print or translation services. And we have some online self-paced trainings. And Emerson, I can add the one that you mentioned to here as well. Does anyone have any questions? I'm going to stop sharing my screen. The other thing too, while you're all thinking of wonderful questions, if you have not already, please put in the chat your name and the MRC unit you are affiliated with for attendance purposes. Any questions, comments? Yes, see a hand.
I wonder about the CARES registry, whether there's another option possibly coming out somewhere else, even though that may be what we use here. Is someone working on a better option?
To my knowledge, no, they're looking to improve the registry. Heather, do you have any comments on that?
Sure. So Vermont's CARES registry has been in use for a while, and they are doing a complete revamp and revision of it to try to make it more widely accepted and understood by the community as a whole, and increase awareness among municipalities on how best to use the data that comes from it. There has not been talk to date of getting rid of the registry. So what we are trying to do is advise the owners of that registry on the CMIST framework and a more of a person-inclusive approach to it, so that it is not just focused on the disability, but on the help that would need to be provided to that individual. It's definitely an imperfect registry. But my understanding is that the E911 Care Board, which operates the registry, as well as Vermont Emergency Management, is open to discussion about equity and inclusion. And we're hoping to make some baby steps with the understanding that there are, lots of other things to do, including, empowering people to do their own planning and to give them access to information and resources to make themselves safe, so that the registry is not necessary.
And I don't know if the question was also asking about outside of this state, but I know there are some states that have just gotten rid of the registry in favor of general access and functional needs planning. Colorado being one of them.
The question, and just more curiosity for folks, is have people seen examples where maybe the needs of access functional needs communities were met in either the preparing for or in the event of a response, like either it was through the flooding or the pandemic? I'm just wondering if there's been positive, there's been lessons learned that we should build on.
Do you have an answer, Jackie, or do you want me to go?
Go ahead.
I would say one of the things that happened during the flood response was that the Green Mountain Self-Advocates on their own came up with this awesome plain language guide to water and boiling your water before drinking it, that was created by self-advocates with intellectual disability, and created to be easily understood by them and had images and stuff. And so they saw that need, knew that they could use some money for it, and then asked their community members to do that for each other and compensated them, and did it within like a week. It was really cool. And I would say that, like, letting the community members take that lead, do what they need to do to meet their needs, make sure that they're getting money for their labor, if you're doing it quickly and stuff like that. But it really worked well for that population.
Thank you.
I think another thing too, that has come out of it as well, is that there has been a lot of discussion within the disability community in Vermont and disability organizations on, you know, what to do next, and to not let it die. Like, you know, we notice all of these things did happen. They could have been better. How do we make sure we continue this conversation and grow from it and not just let it fade out? For instance, so Emerson, you were just doing, leading the workshop with Kate LaRose, and then, sorry, I'm forgetting the organization. I want to say it's something through UVM. Emerson, you probably know, who's doing, like the podcasts of people who were affected by the flooding.
CDCI.
You want to? Yeah. Oh, CDCI.
Yeah,
Did
Center
you want to?
for Disability and Community Inclusion. They're basically going to be doing a similar thing with Green Mountain Self-Advocates, but creating this guide of how to prepare, like, individually for folks with disabilities for an emergency, and taking sort of the CMIS and AFN terms and using them to understand what your needs are, and how to make sure that you have a plan to get them met in an emergency situation. Because we know that emergency planning works best when it happens at all of these different levels, and not just like way up in government, and not just individual people, right? So that was based on a program that they have been doing in Australia, where it's like a disabled person led emergency preparedness, where folks lead their own, like that you train like leaders in the community, and then they teach each other how to prepare and how to create like care networks so that they can get their needs met in emergency. I forget where I was going with that, but we created a guide, and through this workshop, worked with the folks who came to the workshop to create this guide for the state. And it's going to be sort of an updated version of what there's like a Green Mountain Self-Advocates guide. It's going to be a revised version of that in the end, with input from those folks. So CDCI is great. Center for Disability and Community Inclusion.
Yeah. If I unmute you here, it's going to do the loop thing. So we might have to translate to there.
Okay. So two large populations that are struggling with public health crises that were exacerbated during the pandemic. For one population are those who struggle with substance abuse or substance use disorders. And then the other one are those who are living with intimate partner and family violence. And I haven't seen how that's integrated into like how we consider PODS or CMIS or anything like that. It's like 100 million Americans, huge population.
So just to repeat so you all can hear, Hannah was just mentioning that two populations that were really affected during COVID, and that, sorry, I'm just trying to any flooding emergencies in general are people who struggle with substance abuse and people who experience intimate partner violence or other forms of, I guess, domestic violence, and just how that is and can be incorporated into pods and other settings and CMIST, and access and functional needs. So that was the question. So I guess I would say that those people probably would fall under people with access and functional needs. And like other people with access and functional needs, they might require certain resources like transportation or health, safety would probably be a big one. Communication. So yeah, so I guess it's hard because you don't know unless if someone tells you necessarily, unless if you happen to know in another way. So someone who's experiencing like intimate partner violence may not disclose that in any way, or may not ask for like the resources.
They will likely be kept from accessing resources.
Yeah.
I don't know if it's a way to reach out.
Yeah, and Emerson put in the chat that substance use could fall under the medical side, the M, and then an abusive situation certainly falls under safety. I think that, my thought is one of the things that we should probably be thinking of in the communication side, especially for working with, I'm thinking of like Savita or BART or Turning Point. Like when we're doing outreach for an emergent situation, including them as part of the initial contact so that they can get out to the folks that they're serving and work with them as well to say like, okay, do you have a place to keep your meds safe from water? If something does happen to your Suboxone, what do you need to know about that? Like, don't try to take it if it's been wet, like there could be considerations, or it could just dissolve and so they won't have anything. So what are the backup options for someone who has a controlled substance prescribed to them, as an example? But also working with, here in Franklin County, we have Lori's house, and where there may be folks that aren't in their shelter or sheltered under their motel program, but they may know folks. So figuring out, like, coming up, maybe there's an opportunity to work when people are doing safety planning with folks experiencing intimate partner violence, being able to work, okay, in the case of an emergency, what are some things to be thinking of? How can we get in touch with you to let you know that there's flooding, or do you have that could be something that we as the local office could work with our partners as well around thinking about how do we do emergency planning with partners in the community that are having that direct connection and have regular ways of communicating. One thing that I've been thinking of with Triple E being in our community, a lot of, we reached out to CBOEO, who serves folks experiencing homelessness in our region. And one of the things that we had, as a translator resource, we didn't have anything around Triple E in Spanish immediately available. And we have a lot of folks that speak Spanish and work in the farm communities around here. So, and they're outside all the time. And so the chance of getting bit by a mosquito is pretty good, but us putting something in Spanish on Facebook is probably not the way that they're going to see that. So, the state has restrictions on how we can use WhatsApp, but we know that that is a tool that many folks use as a way of communicating. So maybe the state needs to look at how do we use WhatsApp as another alternative way of connecting with communities that don't use the tradition, like the traditional channels of communication that the state is using. So even if we can't do it, maybe, Bridges to Health could be that connector, because they have that trusted relationship and they already have all of those contacts through WhatsApp, and be able to send that out. Just like Savita or Bart or Lori's house might be like, hey, if they get a call from the health department, they might be like, I don't want to talk to the health department, but if I get a call from Lori's house, that's a very, very, very good point for folks to work with.
Another thing I'll just mention really quickly is, and this would just be an additional resource. So, one of the roles in pods is to have like some sort of like mental health related person there, probably for both staff and people who are coming in. So that might be an additional resource for pods. I know we didn't, at least in our region, we didn't have that role in our pods during COVID.
I don't know if anyone did. Regional, I mean, maybe there are folks in the state that did, but
Yeah. Yeah. I'm looking at the time. It is just about 7 o'clock. Does anybody have any other questions before we end the presentation? Not seeing any in the chat.
Just noticing Meredith's comments around translation. Yeah.
Yeah, Meredith wrote, translations are important to have, including for special populations such as Abenaki. Trafficked populations might have an opportunity to get assistance. Knowing what to look for in shelters is useful and who to call. Okay, seeing no more questions. Thank you so much for everyone who participated and joined tonight. We really appreciate it. We're hoping to have more presentations like this. Maybe this will become a series. If you have any thoughts on, what you want to learn about further, please let us know. I'll send out the presentation. It does have all 3 of our contact information. Send any of us an email, and we can make sure to include that in another training or presentation. All right, I hope you all have a wonderful night and thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you all for coming.
Thank you.
Bye.